All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for being here on a Saturday. Welcome to Putting the Brake in the Dirty Break, DSA, the Democrats, and Independent Working Class Politics. My name is Manya. I use she, her pronouns, and I am one of your co-chairs today for this meeting alongside Eve. This event is hosted by Reform and Revolution. We are a revolutionary Marxist caucus within DSA. We're really excited to have this conversation with 5 panelists today, all representing different trends within DSA. Just want to let everybody know that we are recording this event, and we're also live on Facebook. So make sure everybody's good with that. So we'll just go ahead and get started. So a central question that we as socialists in the US have faced for generations is how to develop and sustain a powerful, independent political working class force. We all know that political independence from the ruling class and the formation of the working class as a class for itself through a political party will be necessary in achieving a fundamental socialist transformation of society. But so far, and somewhat uniquely among the working classes of the advanced capitalist economies, we have been unable to develop any sort of sustained and powerful force of this kind. So as membership in the Democratic Socialists of America has skyrocketed over the last 4 years to 95,000 now, and also now with Joe Biden in the White House, this question takes on renewed urgency. What is the best strategy to build towards working class political independence? Does this mean that we work towards building a new political party? How do we build class independence while avoiding the twin pitfalls of marginalization and co-optation? And crucially, what is DSA's role at this current moment? So we're so excited to have an incredible panel of speakers to dive into these questions today. We'll introduce them in just a minute. Before we get into that, I just want to explain what the format of this meeting will be. We are going to have this event in 3 parts. The first will be some opening statements and then some responses from our 5 panelists. Then we'll move into a question and answer section. And we really encourage everyone to submit questions. You can submit them as early as right now if you want to one of our co-hosts, and their title is Submit Questions Here. So go ahead and submit questions at any point. We'd really love to hear from you. And then the third part will move into closing statements. And that will be the order of events. And I'll hand it over to Eve.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Eve Sychik. I use they, them pronouns. Yeah, we have 5 great speakers today who I'm going to introduce now if you want to give a wave as I introduce you. We've got Philip Locker of Reform and Revolution, author of Winning the Dirty Break Under Biden, from Seattle DSA, and the former political director of Kshama Sawant's 2013 campaign. Kshama, of course, was the first socialist elected in Seattle in over 100 years. I've got Landry Levine, DSA Emerge Political Committee and New York City DSA member. Joe Evica, Tempest Collective and Madison DSA member, and OPEIU steward, Local 39, and the author of Taking the Dirty Break Seriously. And we've also got Sam Heft-Luthy from Red Star San Francisco, steering committee of DSA San Francisco, and the member of DSA San Francisco's Electoral Strategy Commission. And finally, Jeremy Gong from Bread and Roses, the East Bay DSA. His writings on socialist strategy have appeared in Jacobin Magazine and The Call. So that's, we try not to make people talk about their own biographical details, so I covered that part, but we are going to have our panelists go around and give brief 1-minute introductions on what their caucus or publication is, that the perspective they're bringing. So let's start with Jeremy Gong. You have 1 minute. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eve. So yeah, my name's Jeremy, and I am currently one of the co-chairs of the Bread and Roses Caucus. Bread and Roses was founded in 2019 to fight for a Marxist DSA. We have supported fighting for an independent labor party and rejecting the realignment strategy at the National DSA conventions, which is obviously relevant to today's conversations. as well as put a lot of emphasis on fighting for a rank and file strategy approach to labor and a working class strategy for socialism. So that is that's the Bread and Roses Caucus. We invite people to look at our website, and we have a publication called The Call, or the Socialist Call, and really encourage people to check that out.
Thank you, Jeremy. Philip.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Eve. It's great to have all these speakers here today. Reform and Revolution is a national DSA caucus, which is working to build a revolutionary Marxist wing of DSA. We want to bring Marxist principles to life in the struggles of that are currently taking place. And we see our challenge is not to abandon or lose sight of all the historical and international experience of workers' struggles that we've accumulated, but to bring them to life in a completely new situation where we have an historically low level of consciousness of working class people around the globe and new challenges. So like over the past few years, we've seen the emergence of major movements like BLM, the climate movement, the global feminist wave, and the Red for Ed strikes here in the US. And particularly here in the US, we've seen the search for socialist ideas, which has huge global implications, which has brought over almost 100,000 members together in DSA. So we want to actively engage in those struggles while developing and spreading revolutionary eco-socialist ideas. So in DSA, for example, we think we're fighting to build DSA into a mass socialist party rooted in the struggles of the working class and the oppressed. And I'm sure that's a topic we'll get into a lot more in the rest of today's discussion.
All right, thank you, Philip. Landry.
Hey everyone, thank you, Eve, and thanks to my co-panelists. I'm Landry, I use they, them pronouns. I'm on the leadership body for DSA Emerge, which is a local caucus in New York City DSA, which is the largest chapter of the organization. Emerge is a caucus that operates on a local level around a strategy of building class struggle and working class institutions. We've done that in New York in places like organizing around the Defund NYPD campaign, organizing to bring a socialist influence to a local community radio station, WBAI. We've also got members who are very involved in some city council campaigns locally and a whole lot of other work. I'm looking forward to talking more about that as we go on.
All right, thank you, Landry. Joe.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Manya and Eve, both for sort of setting this up, and to Reform and Revolution for organizing this. This is, wonderful. As they said, I'm Joe from Madison, Wisconsin. I'm a member of the Tempest Collective, which is a national collective with most members are within DSA, but actually not all of the members of the Tempest Collective find themselves in DSA. And our goal is to put forward a revolutionary vision that sort of weighs in on many of the important questions of the day on the socialist left, and to do so in a very, hopefully clear and understandable way. And there isn't, just to say, since this topic is about the dirty break, there isn't a shared strategy within the Tempest Collective regarding electoral strategy or tactics. So some people kind of fall in the clean break aspect, and some people fall more towards some aspect of the dirty break. But I'd say what sort of binds us together as a collective is a commitment to a shared project of socialism from below. So essentially just the idea that working class self-emancipation is going to come from the working class, not from any other social force in society.
Thank you, Joe. And last but not least, we have Sam.
Hey, I'm Sam. I am a member of Red Star San Francisco. We're a revolutionary Marxist caucus that organizes within DSA San Francisco. Some of our major areas of focus involve analyzing and resolving the contradictions within DSA San Francisco and the national organization, cultivating and supporting new worker organization and developing union density and international solidarity within DSA and connections with the larger global socialist movement to reject revisionist and imperialist lines within DSA. A third priority focus for us, fourth priority focus that cuts across all of that, is political education and agitation across the organization and within the chapter. So if it's not a problem. I'm going to post a link to bit.ly/redstartreg, which is our weekly education panel. We're in the process of a series on imperialism. We just read Lenin's Imperialism. We're reading Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, and we're continuing on with Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth to really push back on a DSA which has been for too long too permissive of lines which put DSA in contradiction with growing international socialist movements across the world.
Thank you, Sam. All right, I just want to quickly remind our audience, thank you for coming. If you have questions, we're going to have a question section at the end, and you can DM them on Zoom. There's a user called Submit Cues here, which should be in your little DM dropdown, and you can start submitting those at any time. So we're going to come back to that, but I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. And yeah, we're going to kind of dig into the meat of our discussion now. We're going to go around and have some opening remarks from each of our panelists on, making the dirty break real and working class political independence as they see it. This is going to be about 7 minutes each, give or take. We'll put up some time cards for you. And yeah, let's dig into it. And again, thank you to our panelists and to the audience for making time today. We'll start with Philip.
Great, thanks. Well, I think this discussion comes at a important time of some flux in DSA, where I think there's a growing awareness that there's a contradiction between the actual practice of DSA's electoral work and the formal position that was adopted at its last national convention, which was fundamentally a dirty break strategy, which setting the goal of building an independent workers' party, but for now, tactically using the Democratic ballot line to build DSA in preparation for a future split. And this is a critical question in that the center of DSA's success over the past period has been its electoral work. At the forefront of the growth of DSA and the new socialist movement in the US has been a slew of socialist candidates running overwhelmingly on the Democratic Party ballot line, though not all. And the ones running on the Democratic Party ballot line trying to stand out as a distinct force from the Democratic establishment. And it's been out of those campaigns that have been the primary vehicles for popularizing socialist ideas and activating and building a new socialist movement, which DSA has been the foremost organized expression of. However, in my view, the way this has often been applied in practice is not really in line with the policy that DSA has set. There's the task of building a new working class party is treated overwhelmingly as a prospect for the distant future, which doesn't have much bearing on our practical work today. And I think it's become more apparent to people there's a certain dissonance between this practice and policy. And that, I think, has begun to be sensed in DSA in the aftermath of the defeat of Bernie's 2020 campaign and Biden now moving towards a more liberal Keynesian reforms. And it's led to a certain mood, in my sense is within DSA, to change our policy to reflect more accurately the actual practice, to bring the policy in line with the actual practice, which is not very focused on building towards an independent workers' party or a future break from the Democratic Party. And in my view, and the position I'm going to be coming from, and the caucus, I'm speaking from Reform Revolution, I think that would be a step backward. In our view, DSA should continue as a tactic, and I underline that as a tactic, to use the Democratic ballot line where this is advantageous for the socialist movement. But for us, the decisive question is, regardless of the tactic, or even when we deploy that tactic of using the Democratic Party ballot line, is how is this carried out in terms of what's the political content, what's the political message when we use that tactic, and what strategic aim is the tactic tied to? Or to put it a different way, is it a tactic that's being deployed as part of a conscious strategy of working to break up the Democratic Party and actually informs our message when we use that tactic? Or, as I think more and more there's been a drift towards, is it part of a strategy of working to reform the Democratic Party, which we don't agree with? So if we are using it as a tactic that's explicitly and consciously tied to working to break up the Democratic Party, what would that mean? Not just as a future aim and aspiration, but what would it mean for our practical electoral campaigns? And we've done some work on this in our caucus, and we recently published an article, which I'm sort of touching on some of the key themes. But if people are interested, they should definitely, I'll drop the link in after I'm done. People can read for more detail the article. But we've sort of pointed to 4 key things we think if we want to really put that dynamic break into the dirty break, 4 aspects we would like to see more of. I think one is building DSA on the model of a party surrogate, which meaning developing a culture where DSA democratically decides who to run in what races and sets the overall political program of the campaign. The DSA, regardless of the ballot line we're using, the DSA is operating as a political party type formation and developing that culture internally. Second is, and I think there's a lot of agreement amongst our speakers here today on that part. A second thing is, regardless of the ballot line tactics, that that we would want DSA candidates, whatever ballot line they're on, to run with a unambiguous, independent political profile. That if we choose the tactic of running the Democratic Party ballot line, we don't change our political message. We maintain an open socialist and class struggle political message. And what that means is, I think key aspects of that are not happening enough is openly identifying as a socialist opposed to the Democratic Party's corporate establishment, and not just saying this internally to campaign volunteers or to DSA members, but with a crystal clear public profile, which is a key theme of the campaign. And all too often, DSA candidates, that does not come through loud and clear. Openly arguing that we need a working class political party, regardless what ballot line one's running on. A key theme of the campaign's message is we need a working class political party, which means a structured mass membership democratic organization of struggle as an instrument for our collective action and collective struggle. And third, refusing to support corporate Democrats, even if you're running on the Democratic Party ballot line, if you lose the primary or if you win the position in future races, and actively promoting, challenging as many establishment Democrats as possible. Third is educating supporters that we are building our forces in preparation for a coming split, and to speak this openly and plainly. So I think it would mean DSA plainly hammering away at a message of the Democratic Party is a big business party. When we run on its ballot line, it's part of a tactic to build support for left policies, to grow DSA and stimulate social struggle. But we recognize sooner or later a reckoning with the Democratic establishment is unavoidable, and we're working to build up our forces and win over the Democrats' left-wing base, electoral base, in preparation for a coming split. To say that frankly and clearly and explicitly, and really develop a clear consciousness in DSA on that. I don't think that's happening sufficiently. And fourth, and finally, is to seek out viable opportunities. If it's truly a tactic and we run on the Democratic Party ballot line where it's advantageous, we also shouldn't have a rigid dogma about it. And seek out opportunities to run independent of the Democratic ballot line also where that's possible and feasible. And I think there are, too often it's assumed that that's not possible. And just to give some examples, in New York State, which is originally where I'm from, there are fusion voting laws that would allow DSA candidates to run on a socialist ballot line while retaining the ability to compete and campaign and fight for the Democratic nomination in Democratic primaries. Why hasn't that been taken more advantage of? Aside from New York, and I'm just wrapping up on this, Jordan, there's clear openings for viable independent campaigns where there's strong DSA chapters in many local races, which are in cities which are dominated by one party cities. And we've seen, I don't have time to go into it, but different examples of that where we've had successful, viable, and winning campaigns. So just to conclude, in our view, the argument for the dirty break has real merit. If the idea is that it's a tactic, it's a tactical question, but regardless of the tactic, we should still run open class struggle socialist candidates. And the challenge has been how to actually carry that out. And I hope the proposals, those 4 proposals we put forward, is a helpful start of thinking through how do we maintain a consistent socialist message, regardless of what political ballot line we have. And I think if we do that, we'd be taking real steps towards breaking free of building a clear challenge to big business Democratic Party politics.
Thank you so much, Philip. All right, next we've got Landry.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Philip. Thank you to the co-panelists in Reform and Revolution. In preparing for today, I was actually struck reading everyone's different contributions and essays that I think there's a lot of agreement on some various points. So I think that's really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to talking about it. So I'll be drawing on some of Emerge's collective statements that we've written on some of these topics. Some of those I've written. Other things are just going to be my own opinion. So I think for Emerge and for myself, the question of the dirty break is deeply a question of working class independence, which is a question more deeply of the situation we find ourselves in over the past several decades of disorganization and the dismemberment of working class organizations. So falling union density, the way that nonprofits have replaced some of the functions of previous working class organizations, where the state has disorganized the working class. And I think that we see this reflected in the defeats of some of the biggest working class mobilizations of the past year. I think the Bernie campaign was one, and I think the summer's Black Lives Matter uprisings were another. I think both were really serious working class mobilizations, but were held back by, for the Bernie campaign, it was the fact that the campaign has a short time scale. It has to end. It's directed by Bernie Sanders himself. For the summer's uprisings, I think the ebbs and flows of the street movement meant that there wasn't an organization that could sustain the movement during its ebbs. And the gap in working class organization meant that liberal forces could co-opt the movement and mislead the movement within the first week is kind of what I noticed in the streets. Is very rapidly the misleadership was setting in. So I think for Emerge and for myself, the desirability of an organization that could operate like a socialist party would be that we'd have an organization that could organize different fronts of working class struggle, act as a headquarters of working class struggle, unite different fronts, and pull socialists together and kind of give continuity between different struggles. And I think that I agree with probably maybe everyone else on the call that the way to get a party or an organization that operates like a party is not realignment. It's not a clean break. For realignment, the idea of taking over the Democratic Party, it's been tried for decades. And realignment proponents did succeed in pushing Southern Democrats out of the Democratic Party in the 70s, but that didn't put labor or progressives in control of the party. The McGovern-Fraser reforms didn't do that either. And I think for a clean break proponents suggest that getting a ballot line is going to be, I think, a major step towards class independence. And I think they maybe get it backwards. I think that a ballot line, an independent ballot line, would be reflective of a higher level of working class organization and a higher level of class struggle. And I think that this is maybe why you see the Green Party struggles to be a representative of the working class. I think that they put so much effort into maintaining their ballot line that they don't then go out and organize working class struggle. I think, Philip mentioned fusion ballot laws in New York. The Working Families Party is a party in New York that's kind of premised off using that fusion ballot. But I think because the Working Families Party is still relying on somewhat the same social basis as the Democratic Party and the same nonprofit complex, I think that the Working Families Party, we see how they will, they'll run Cuomo on their line in the general election, or in the presidential election, they encourage people to vote Biden and Harris on their line, saying, oh, well, we need to maintain our ballot line. The easiest way for us to do that is to siphon off votes from Cuomo or Biden or whoever. So I think that if we set out to develop an independent line before we've built an independent basis, an organizational basis, so that means unions, rank and file caucuses within unions, tenant unions, mutual aid societies, the whole gamut, cultural societies, the whole kind of edifices that socialist parties of old had. If we don't develop those, we're not going to give our future party organization the independence, the ability to have its own independent class basis. And I think that this is some of the reason why Emerge in New York has been really interested in with these city council races that we're engaged in now, in finding ways to tie our candidates to movement work. And this has been something that I think our chapter in New York City has been actually pretty good at. I think our socialist slate of Senate members and Assembly members was really strong on this, of being out socialists, of being people who came out of our organization or other class struggle organizations. And I think that for Emerge, we're very supportive of, for instance, Michael Hollingsworth's campaign. He comes out of a tenant union that's in my neighborhood in Crown Heights. Brandon West is a strong proponent of defund NYPD. And I think in Crown Heights, where I live in Brooklyn, you can kind of see the way, you can see how a mass party might start to look in the future, with the way that tenant unions, rank and file teacher caucuses, mutual aid societies, electoral campaigns, all start to kind of meld together into a kind of common social basis. And our campaigns in New York for Assembly and State Senate won about 90,000 votes in total, which I think suggests that we are starting to build not only an electoral constituency, but our main goal, which would be building the kind of class struggle independence and class struggle organizations that can scaffold future working class struggle. Now, I'll briefly say, and I'll get more to this maybe later on, is that I think when we talk about the dirty break, we should be cognizant of a few problems, or there's a few things we should consider in broadening the scope of our conversation. One is that I think we have to be very insistent that the dirty break doesn't become a stagist kind of strategy to say that first we break from the Democrats, then we have a party, then we'll win an election, etc. I think that if we build a working class political bloc, I think that politics might shake out a little bit more messily than that. So I think we can't turn dirty break into something that's stagist. I think we also have to answer how a future socialist party is going to free itself. And thank you, Jordan, for the timekeeper. I'll wrap up here in a second. A socialist party, how is it going to free itself from the constraints that capital and liberal democracy places on all parties in our political system? So even if we rectified problems with the Democrats by having a party that had a dues-paying mass membership, that didn't have a class collaborationist basis, how would our new socialist party not just end up doing what socialist parties, communist parties, labor parties globally have done over the past several decades, kind of falling prey to the pressures of government and of austerity and capital? And I think that lastly, just to wrap up, that points us towards a last problem that we should consider, which is we should really grapple with the experience of the 20th century, which is to say that very often in the 20th century, socialist parties and communist parties, labor parties, all came to power, whether electorally or through insurrection, what have you. And once in power, felt the same pressures of government, of demobilizing, disorganizing their own constituencies that put them there in the first place. So I think we need to be really serious about that and think about, as we're kind of talking about building this party, how do we also build the kind of organizations that can put pressure on our socialists in government? And how can we build the organizations that can defend them from counter-revolutionary pressures and not fall prey to these same kinds of difficulties? So thank you. Looking forward to talking more about it.
Thank you so much, Landry. I have Joe next.
Awesome, thank you. So in preparing for this, I guess there were two questions that were kind of asked of me. And one of them was sort of, what is like the correct socialist electoral strategy? And, what should we say in regards to the sort of 150 DSA endorsed socialist candidates that are in office right now? How do we interact with them? How do we, build an electoral strategy that reflects sort of our initial circumstances? So I'll start kind of broad and then try to get a little bit more specific in what I'm talking about here, and just sort of say that, when it comes to correct socialist electoral strategy, I think it's honestly somewhere between, a clean and dirty break. And, part of the reason I say that is just that politics is as much of an art as it is a science, because, while it's absolutely true, I think in my mind, that We're going to need an independent political party to achieve socialism in the US or internationally. That fact alone doesn't negate the reality of the fact that millions of people come to socialism and to socialist politics through political activity that is siphoned through our two-party political system, and that we have to be able to relate to those people as much as we relate to the millions of people who actually don't vote in the United States as well. And so handling that contradiction is sort of, the art of, I think, politics, right? In many cases, I think particularly locally, it makes very little sense to run on a Democratic Party ballot line, particularly in Madison. We have nonpartisan elections. There's not even such thing, right? And there's a number of cases where I think in running independently, for strategic reasons is not very much different than running on the Democratic Party ballot line. But there are absolutely races, I think, where it can make sense to run as a Democrat while following, many of the things that Philip sort of outlined in the beginning when he was speaking, if we're being, honest about things. I think, when it comes to DSA endorsed candidates, there's such an array of DSA endorsed candidates, right? There's DSA endorsed candidates who are not DSA members, right? There's Bernie Sanders and, a number of different DSA endorsed candidates like that. There's DSA endorsed candidates who are on paper DSA members, but aren't relationally, a part of our movement in the way, that we're working with them or interacting with them on a regular basis. And there are also DSA endorsed candidates who are DSA members who are, participate in our chapters and things like that. And so we should recognize that, there's different ways that I think we need to be relating to all three of those kinds of groups. So a small amount, I'd say, of the DSA endorsed candidates become active participants and plan to maintain those relationships as elected officials. And I think it matters, that we try to maintain our relationships with them throughout their whole sort of tenure in office. We have to find ways to relate to all of them, but I think that the kind of support that we provide should really be dependent on how committed they are to the, our organization's projects and the project of socialism as a whole. I think that's really important. To the extent that democratic socialist elected officials support things that we support, I think that we should be working with them and using their platform to build our struggles. For a few years, I worked at Delta Airlines, and we were involved in an organizing drive with the Machinists Union. We reached out to Bernie Sanders, to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan, who was running for governor. And we used, we got support from them. We organized with them. They came to our rallies. They invited us to their campaigns, and we used their platform to build our movement. And to the extent that we can do that, we should be working in relation with those kinds of politicians. But that I think that we should be clear, where we draw lines when it comes to those kinds of candidates as well. In that way, that we're trying to use their platform to build, our movements and our organizations. And it can't sort of be the same kind of two-way street. There is actually a primacy to building independent socialist organization over and above, providing full-on support for candidates like that. So generally speaking, I think we have to move from an endorsement-centered model of electoral work towards more of a sort of accountability-centric kind of model. So we need to do a little bit less piggybacking off of candidates who have already decided that they're going to run an election. And I know that this is difficult. Just being a DSA member doesn't make you accountable to, as an elected official. And we have to figure out ways that we can actually build mechanisms of accountability. So that's really important. I think We should consider, whether DSA itself can be that sort of pre-party formation, or whether we need to build some kind of membership organization with its own name and identity in order to do that. We should be actively recruiting people from movements to run. We should be raising money. We should train members internally on the logistics of organizing, rather than sort of outsourcing a lot of that work to Democratic, party apparatuses or strategists. We should be recruiting leaders specifically, I think, from the Black Lives Matter movement. Philip talked about or Sam maybe talked about the ebbs and flows of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's existed, for years. And one way that we can help maintain the continuity in the organization is by actually recruiting people from those movements to participate in consistent electoral activity and work as well. So I'll say other things we have to do are develop messaging and materials for candidates to reduce redundancy. We can get candidates to run, and we should make sure that they associate themselves and promote a sort of pre-party organization, as Philip was kind of suggesting as well. We should be very, and I will wrap up in just a second here, Jordan, thank you. We should be intentional and purposeful and consistent in our messaging when we're organizing electoral work. And basically, I think we should start bridging the gap now from where we actually exist in our movements to being able to start the process of today trying to build an independent sort of political party.
Thank you so much, Joe. Next we have Sam.
Thank you, and thanks for hosting the panel and inviting us on. Really excited to get into this. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the Democratic Party is less a party or a party surrogate, or what we tend to talk about building as our work, and more a diffuse and ill-defined collection of loosely related technologies, political action committees, and listservs. To advocate a dirty break requires something to break from, and I'm not convinced that there's ever going to be a satisfactory metric of that break as long as the Democratic Party remains as structurally incoherent as it is. But the real task facing DSA, far more than how we should relate to the Democratic Party, is to take seriously the question of just what we as DSA actually are. My prior description of the Democratic Party, a diffuse and ill-defined collection of loosely related technologies, political committees, and listservs, applies far too much to DSA in its current composition as well. Many in DSA have turned to us here in the San Francisco chapter, citing our electoral successes. And it's true that chapter members and chapter endorsed campaigns have done great work for the city and put our membership in direct contradiction with capital. We've built free legal representation to any tenant facing eviction in the city. We've helped curtail the excesses of the San Francisco Police Officers Association. We've established greenfield public services infrastructure for homeless residents of San Francisco. We won double victories for supervisor candidate Dean Preston and 2 ballot measures to tax real estate transfers to pay for rent relief and social housing. And we fought a surprisingly close race for Jackie Fielder in a state Senate campaign. But my experience in DSASF has shown a deep level of institutional incoherence, unnecessary contradiction between members, and lack of democratic investment in our electoral work that is endemic to the organization and which we cannot shy away from. Ours is a DSA chapter that, like many, consists more of a collection of independent organizations with a shared brand than a coherent democratic vehicle for collective action. Most of the electoral questions that have come to our membership came having already been developed and launched ahead of time, even when it was chapter active members running for office with active chapter members serving as campaign staff. This, we believe, is the principal contradiction facing DSA, not a question of our orientation that we must now either call opportunist or ultra-leftist, but of DSA's failure to be able to actually develop a coherent strategy and exert the discipline to ensure any members doing DSA work are actually carrying that strategy out. We believe this requires, 1, the bravery to look at our work in DSA and acknowledge its deep limitations for sustainable organizational development. We cannot performatively take credit for work that DSA doesn't have real democratic control over. The role of DSA and whatever our future party surrogate style dirty broken institution that we hope to form should be to build training in the iron discipline and rigorous strategic development that we need to effectively capture and wield state power when capitalism's crises erupt. To abandon this principle is to replace the revolutionary line, the subjective horizon of developing the muscle for political democracy, in favor of moribund reformism, a belief that the objective results of our struggle will get us anywhere without a revolutionary crisis and a party that stands able to take advantage of it. 2, the development of a powerful and independent mechanism for waging electoral struggle. DSA must place organizational independence and thorough measuring of success above a manic and petty bourgeois obsession with doing the work, which in an NGO-dominated political climate can only mean doing the work of others rather than the task of building power for and as DSA. The role of DSA in the American socialist movement in all forms must be to train an awakening working class that the only path forward is in organization. That democracy is not simply a mechanism for empowerment of one's personal priorities, but as the process of being disciplined by the priorities of others as well. This will be a gradual process of development. We cannot declare a workers' party and be done with it, but neither are we free to shrug our shoulders and model our organization after the Central Intelligence Agency, with cutouts, no formal accountability, and leaders who exist mostly as people to vent our frustration upon. The DSA cannot really speak of strategy until we have robust democratic mechanisms for developing a strategy and making it hegemonic within the organization. We must develop those mechanisms and then vie as the constituency pushing for the adoption of a class-independent horizon as that hegemonic approach. And 3, we must cease to be an organization that grows without concrete connections between existing and new members. A Bernie bump can grow our ranks, but it conditions a certain type of new member with a certain idea of the horizon of struggle DSA is equipped to wage. As long as DSA remains an organization that people join because they see the news, we can only aspire to the eclectic average socialism that is characteristic of the working class movement in its infancy and represents a step backwards in our consciousness. It is for that reason that DSA should support electoral work when and only when it gives us a mechanism to build concrete connections to our broader work, ideally around chapter priorities, which demonstrate our ability to focus and discipline our struggle, and as a funnel towards more directly proletarian activity, such as tenant and labor organizing and community solidarity work, which should be the way the vast majority of unorganized Americans come into contact with DSA. It is only with these 3 tools, a clear and frank analysis of our work, a powerful and independent organizational structure, and shedding our status as the organization you join because you watch the news, that we can even begin to answer the question of the dirty or clean break or independence from Democrats. We must acknowledge that there is no left or movement in the abstract, only people toiling for a better future and the organizational relationships they enter into by chosen compact. If we are to seek a dirty break, there must be something that we can break away in the first place, and no starry-eyed conversation should tear us from that primary task. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And finally, we have Jeremy.
Thanks so much, everybody. It's been a very interesting conversation so far. So I'm going to start by outlining what I think is actually a pretty great degree of agreement across all of the statements that have come so far, and things that I agree with from what people have said. I think maybe we would have been surprised a year or 2 ago if we had got this group together and find that on at least the questions that we're addressing so far, there's not a lot of substantial disagreement. So the first thing, which people have talked about a lot, and I don't want to belabor, we all agree we want to have an independent party. We reject the strategy of relying on the Democratic Party. I agree with everything that's been said about how important that is, and I agree with what Phil said earlier, that this is something that is, to one degree or another, I think, in question in DSA now. Something that often comes up in these discussions is that the need for an independent party makes more sense to ordinary non-activist people than it does to many activists. And why is this? I think for most people, politics is simply a contest between parties. People who aren't very involved in politics, they think of it as the Democrats versus Republicans. But progressive activists have learned through disappointment that this contest is mostly irrelevant to the work we're doing, and doesn't really matter that much if Biden gets elected, insofar as how that affects whether or not we're going to win rent control here in Oakland, for example. So what happens is that progressive activists basically lose interest in formal parties, and sometimes even lose interest in electoral politics in general. That's because there's not a major alternative political vehicle that could express what these activists are interested in. In other words, the party that we want doesn't yet exist. this creates a sense that parties don't really matter among activists, which is very ironic because I think the ordinary person understands that parties are a useful political tool. I think most activists have never seen that before. So it's very important that we fight this problem within DSA and among activists that were around, including in unions and elsewhere, that parties actually are important tools. We just have never really seen a useful one in our lives. And I think that a lot of people in DSA don't really understand why we advocate for this or how important it is. I think they might think it's just a distraction from electing the right people. That's often a phrase you hear is you want to elect the right people. Or it's a distraction from passing progressive legislation that can actually help people. But as Marxists, we understand that politics is not primarily about personalities or about policies, but it's about power. And for the working class, that power must be organized into unions and parties. Even if we elect the right people, without building organizations of and for the working class will just simply not have the power to ensure that its interests are defended and advanced, let alone could we achieve socialism. So that's something I think we all agree on. Another thing we agree on now, which I think is maybe not where it would have been a year or two ago, is that we all agree that for the time being, many of our candidates and our socialist candidates that we support will have to run as Democrats. And I think we agree that it was valuable, that Bernie's campaign brought a lot of value to the movement that we're building, even though there are contradictions and limitations inherent in the Bernie project. And we all also acknowledge those. I think we also all agree that not enough has been done to flesh out, as someone said earlier, put meat on the bones of the dirty break strategy. I think Andy and Joe were right when they say there's a bit of an underpants gnome problem insofar as we say, look, the first step is run on the Democratic ballot line, the second step, question mark, the third step, independent party. I think that is sort of a problem that we're trying to solve. And I think that people on this call, especially Phil with his opening statement, was putting forward more meat for those bones, and I really appreciate that. I think maybe I could nitpick some things I disagree with, but it's a lot easier for me to nitpick than it is to come up with new good ideas. So I'm grateful for people who are putting those things forward. So with those things in mind, I also want to say I think that there's multiple proposals that people have published for the DSA convention, including Reform and Revolution and others, that are similar but different. And I worry that if these groups don't unite on a simple resolution that's a sort of consensus among these different caucuses, et cetera, that none of them will even see the agenda because it's going to be very challenging to get on the agenda. So one way or another, the process is pretty confusing. There's a platform we can propose amendments to. There's resolutions that people have already proposed. I think I wouldn't support any of them as they currently exist because I don't fully agree with them, but I think there's something has to be on the agenda that says DSA rejects realignment of the Democratic Party. We are for building an independent workers' party. I think there might be some basic concrete elements we can include in that, but I think it's important to think about what are the consensus elements of that. And I'd be happy to talk about that after this call as well. So there's other aspects too, I think, that we need to keep in mind here, and it doesn't usually come up as much in these conversations about parties. So I think the prompt from our facilitator was how do we avoid the twin dangers of marginality on the one hand and co-optation on the other? I would describe, we talk about opportunism. I would describe opportunism as basically saying the conditions that exist now are permanent and natural. In other words, the conditions don't exist now for an independent party, let alone a socialist revolution. So we have to just accept that and then do what we can with the elected officials that we can get in there. And I think the sort of sectarian position is saying, actually, the conditions do exist now for an independent party. I think the Marxist position in this case is to say, look, we recognize the conditions aren't there. The opportunists are correct about that, but they're wrong that we have to accept those. It's our job to try and change those conditions over the long term. And more concretely, the conditions that don't currently exist for us are a mass consciousness of ordinary people that this needs to happen, and a high degree of class struggle that would both build that consciousness, because the vast majority of people learn through their own struggles, and also would construct organizations that would be the sort of concrete basis of such a party in the future. I think there's often a mistake where we cite polling saying third party would be popular or Medicare for all is popular. There's a huge difference between there being a vague potential electorate that supports our ideas and concrete, permanently organized social base in the working class in the form of primarily unions that is actively organizing and permanently discussing these things and trying to bring them into existence. Right now, it's just simply not possible to have the latter because the labor movement is mostly, inert or backward or whatever you want to call it. The level of class struggle is extremely low in our society right now, and we can't build a mass party on the basis of that. So we are having enormous progress on one, I think, very important task, which is the socialist movement has been reborn. There is a socialist movement in this country. There wasn't before. I think DSA and Jacobin, I think Bernie and AOC represent something that just simply didn't exist before. And that's incredibly important, but it's completely divorced, almost completely divorced from any sort of working class social base that's ready to actually carry out those policies. So, you know, there have been some promising things, most importantly, the teacher strike wave. Now we're seeing activity at Amazon, which could end up being sort of some of the front lines of the class struggle in this country because of how important Amazon is to our economy. But these are tiny. I mean, you know, the teacher strike wave was the largest number of workers to go on strike in 40 years, something like 400,000 in 2018, and then almost that many again in 2019. But in 1947, there were 5 million that went on strike, and they couldn't win a workers' party then. So we have to understand, you know, and that was when they're being betrayed by Democrats, et cetera. I mean, the conditions couldn't have been better in the 30s and 40s for building a workers' party. So we have to understand that while we're building a DSA, we're building socialism, we're electing the socialist candidates. I agree with what everyone said about that before, so I won't repeat it. There's an important element that often goes unspoken in this discussion, which is where is the working class movement? Where are the revitalized unions that are going to carry this forward? This is why Bread and Roses is why I've been such a prominent or such a proponent of the rank and file strategy. Socialists need to go into the working class to help revitalize the labor movement from below and bring socialism into the struggles of workers, especially in strategic industries where you can actually win. And that includes logistics like Amazon. I think these are the places where socialists can actually bring class struggle, help build class struggle, and then connect it up with the socialist activity that DSA chapters are doing a great job of building independently of that right now. So I'll stop there. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to all our panelists. We're going to move to the part that I'm personally most excited about, is having panelists respond to each other. We're going to give everybody, I believe it's, here we go. Yeah, like 7 minutes or so, right? Is that right? Yes. 3 minutes each. There we go. 3 minutes each, you know, give or take, to make responses. I want to encourage panelists to pull out, you know, differences, especially that they feel are out there between the political approach of the people on this call. I think Jeremy and others said it's very interesting that there's been a bit of a new consensus, I think, on these issues between caucuses and tendencies in DSA that we're thinking very differently before. And I think that's interesting. We've talked a lot about it. I think it would be interesting to pull out what some of the differences are. If we're going to have panelists use the raise hand function to get on, and Manya will be facilitating. I also want to pick up the thread of the idea of a sort of consensus DSA convention resolution against realignment or in favor of working class independence or a new party. What would that mean? You know, like, is there a shared political vision of the groups and caucuses? Obviously, we can't speak for our whole caucuses, but, and also in particular, what are the obstacles to a resolution like that? Like, what are the main political divides that exist in this group that could be an obstacle to that? And can they be overcome? What are the points of consensus? And if so, how? And I think the only other thread I'm going to pull out now is around Nevada. So there was a recent takeover of the Nevada Democratic Party by Las Vegas DSA and others. If folks want to, that's something we haven't really discussed. Like, what is the meaning of that? What does it mean for how people in DSA are thinking about working class independence? Is it something we should be paying a lot of attention to? And what's our analysis of it? So that's what I'm going to leave it there. If panelists want to use the raise hand function, I'll turn it over to Manya to facilitate the next part of the discussion.
And we'll let the panelists decide who wants to come on first for this section. So jump on. Gotta have someone take the bait first. Awesome. Go ahead, Sam.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think I did an okay collection of my thoughts, so hopefully this will be useful. I think I'd like to call out what several folks said, that there's a strong degree of alignment among the folks on this call about, at least to a certain extent, the horizon of our work and what we want to be building. But that being said, I think we need to acknowledge that is a far cry from the practical work needed to transform the organization in the way that we want to transform the organization. Philip called out the passage of a national resolution last convention and its failure to change DSA's position. And Jeremy mentioned the need to organize for the 2021 convention. So I would ask, do we actually have the ability for a national resolution to go down to lower bodies and tangibly change their strategy? Did the passage of a resolution for class struggle elections make this strategy actively dominant within the organization? I would say that the answer to those questions right now is no. The current situation with caucuses is basically the only mechanism for members to connect with national work leads to a strange and contradictory situation where unorganized local members act in opposition to what they perceive as dominant cadres within any individual local. And I don't think it's a healthy way to be operating. It's a strange and contradictory phenomenon. And as long as the local remains a primary unit of DSA and there are no real channels for engagement with national work, then what we, I believe, have to be doing is build the organizational relationships within our own locals around these issues in order to actually tangibly transform the organization. And so I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that approach. Like, I'm honestly not convinced that like organizing to have one electoral strategy resolution at national is a great idea. We should do it. It's cool. It'll build connections in that great old Leninist newspaper model. But like, does that mean anything? I'm not convinced that it really does. And I think we need to take that seriously. Also, I just sort of want to call out, as we think about the function and form of a party, like a gravity well towards a particular spectacleization of politics. Like I've heard a few people talk about workers seeing the party rather than acting within it and operating through it, as well as us seeing organizing efforts that are sort of separate from ourselves, like seeing the Amazon organizing, seeing teacher strikes. And I think it's just super important that we need to be actually talking about working class activity and the work that organization does to condition and develop that activity through a process of active development rather than simply establishing a position and expecting that people will see it through our obviously corrupted and terrible media apparatuses.
Thanks, Sam. That was great. And yeah, it brought up some interesting points about the 2021 convention, which would be awesome to hear other folks come in on as well, if you like, or anything else that you want to respond to that any of the other panelists have said during this time. All right, and we've got Landry next. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll do it. There's been a lot of really interesting threads that people have brought up. So it's hard to know what to respond to, what to respond to when. I want to pull out something Sam was just saying. I think Jeremy said it as well, which is that we should agree, and I'm hearing that agreement, that a major function of a party-like organization is to aid in the recomposition of working class organization, which has for so long been disorganized due to the state and the Democrats and et cetera. And I think that's because we understand, and I've heard this said by different people on the call, that the working class isn't just, it's not like a sleeping giant that we just have to wake up by running the right candidate who has a S for socialist next to their name. And then everyone's like, whoa, like Jeremy, I think is exactly right, that polling for, saying however many % of people would support a new party doesn't really get at it, because politics is mediated through organization. It's not just mediated through, I think it's kind of something that liberal democracy deceives us into thinking that politics is about whatever 51% of poll respondents think. But politics isn't about getting 51% of people to agree with you. It's about building the organizations that can mediate higher levels of class struggle. And so I think for us, a task for DSA is for DSA to become an organization of organizers who are really capable of building class struggle organization either where they work, in a workplace, in a rank and file union, or organizing a new shop, building a worker center, or where they live, maybe in a tenant union or a neighborhood association or something like that. I think also the role of bringing social movements into this is really key. And when we talk about class struggle organization, that's something I often am thinking about a lot, because we know what a class struggle organization looks like in labor or in housing, but I want us to figure out more what it can look like in the social movement sphere. What can mass organizations and movement organizations look like to help us bridge and bring in these different fronts of struggle? And lastly, if we're talking about what a resolution for the convention should look like, I agree that we should be building up more robust democratic processes, regional or statewide organizations that can help connect locals to national, because currently locals are very atomized. And if we're talking about how to approach electoral, I think getting candidates who are running as socialists and who are drawn from our organization or adjacent class struggle organizations should be a priority, because I think we do really need to fight against the tendency to just endorse a liberal progressive who's not really coming from our movement. I think that's something we really have to be wary of.
Thanks, Landry. We've got Joe next. Go ahead.
Thanks. So lots of stuff. I'll say first, Philip mentioned in the very beginning the question of sort of whether we're swinging the pendulum towards political independence, or if we're kind of running in place right now when it comes to the dirty break strategy, or in fact even reverting somewhat, which I think it's clear that within DSA there has been a little bit of a sort of movement away from the idea of the need for political independence. And that I think is a negative, and we should be working, collectively to figure out what we can do to reaffirm the desire and the need for political independence. I think maybe one of the things that we agree on is that a higher level of struggle is going to be necessary in order to create and sort of launch any kind of independent party that has a base that actually has the power to do things that matter. Maybe where we disagree is sort of how that aligns in terms of our time horizon and what we should be doing concretely today in order to get to that point. Do we focus most of our energy towards simply building within social movements and within labor, or do we start to build some of the mechanisms that we would see a pre-party formation needing, and starting to kind of cohere those, even if we don't have the mass and the base necessary to contend with the Democratic Party in any kind of sustainable or meaningful way at this point. And I think my response to that is we actually have to start building right now along those lines. And we should be careful not to put it off into any sort of distant future. Two other things that I felt like I heard. One was Sam, who was talking sort of about the need for democracy in DSA and whatnot. I think the Tempest Collective has put forward three different resolutions that we'd like to kind of push towards within the convention. Two of them focus fundamentally around the need for more democracy within our organization. One has to do with a referendum with dealing with referendums, so votes of our membership between conventions. The other one has to do with national leadership accountability, which I think both are really fundamental to organizing and making our organization more accountable to the membership. And then lastly, I'll say that related to sort of what Jeremy was talking about with the need to sort of reaffirm a political commitment towards independence. Even if we want to talk more about the details of what it would mean, the Tempest Collective has also put forward a proposal that's basically generally meant to reaffirm the need to continue on a path towards political independence. It's not a a sort of well thought out electoral strategy. It's more so just meant to say, this is what we committed to. We still believe that this is a vision for building DSA and for eventually getting socialism. So I'll post a link to an article from the Tempest Collective, which kind of covers those 3 resolutions. And I'm hoping, that other people can talk about resolutions they want to pass as well, and that we can start working together within our various caucuses and organizations to kind of figure out where we can, support one another. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. We'll do Philip next, and then we'll end with Jeremy. So go ahead, Philip.
I think some really interesting points came up in the discussion. The point I think Jeremy mentioned about, and several people have mentioned it, there's a drift in DSA more towards a realignment strategy. And there's a lot of agreement, though, amongst the trends represented here to try to push back against that. And I really agree, if we could find some points of collaboration to try to unite in a common effort away to push in a different direction, more towards independent working class politics, I think that would be very valuable. With Biden in power, and actually ironically, with Biden making certain concessions and a certain left or liberal and Keynesian concessions, I think one of the main dangers facing DSA in this period is being co-opted into the Democratic Party and losing a consciousness and clarity about a distinct independent working class political organization that we're fighting to build. So the more we can find ways to collaborate, the caucus I'm part of, Reform Revolution, has been putting forward 3 resolutions that we've been supporting towards the National Convention that helps, that's trying to push in that direction. We don't believe that's like the only way to do it, and we're happy to see if there's other ways we could collaborate. But the 3 resolutions we've been discussing is one, and I'm open to, it could be a very general resolution of just reasserting the principle of what we're building towards, an independent working class party, that we reject realignment. But I also fear that's better than nothing, but I also fear it's very vague and general and doesn't, and it would be valuable to have resolutions that point more to the practical application. And the 3 resolutions we've been focusing on is, one, trying to concretize what's the socialist message that DSA candidates should be raising about the Democratic Party, regardless of their ballot line. Even if they're running on the Democratic Party ballot line, do they raise a clear socialist message that the Democratic Party as an institution is a big business dominated institution, and that working people need to get organized into their own political organization? We have one about trying to identify 10 strong, viable campaigns where we can run independent from the Democrats in 2022 and make that national priority. We have one about trying to launch an educational campaign towards a Democratic Socialist Party, not prematurely just announcing it and declaring it, but starting an active campaign to build support. I would just say one final thing is just, I think a theme in this discussion that's related to all these things is, I think we have a big challenge of trying to clarify what we mean by political party, because what's cemented in the US of the Democratic and Republican parties, and I think Sam and maybe others mentioned this, it's just like a brand, that the relationship between regular people in that party is this very passive thing. I just vote for it, and it's these politicians, they decide the politics, and my relationship is just to vote for them passively. And I think we really want to stress, whatever tactics we're doing, the idea of a political party, but fundamentally different idea of a democratic, member-run, collective organization of struggle on the electoral plane, yes, but also in social movements, in workplaces, a tool, an instrument for our class to organize and fight together and debate ideas and discuss and take common action. And that, I think, is one of the key things, I'll just wrap up on this, that's missing from a lot of the DSA candidates, is no matter, again, what ballot line is running on, is a clear and unambiguous message that, like, if you elect me, I can't just solve your problems. I will use my platform to help you get organized. I promise, if I'm elected, I will use my platform to encourage struggles that are taking place. If you support my campaign, you need to join DSA. We need to get organized. We need to build our own independent, socialist, and working class organization. At this time, I think DSA is the best instrument. You should join us. That message, I think, needs to come through more loud and clear, rather than vote for me and I will deliver these things.
Thanks, Philip. And take it away, Jeremy.
Thanks, and again, really benefiting from listening. So thanks everyone for sharing. A couple of, well, the last comment I made, I said, essentially, we can't substitute DSA for the working class. We might be ready to launch a party, but there's not a mass social base that's organized to support that effort. And if we were, therefore, it would be a failure one way or another. I would say, I think there's a lot of hand wringing about, oh, it's so hard to have an independent ballot line. The laws are difficult. I think that's sort of a red herring. It's actually not that hard. You just have to have the will to do it. And right now that will exists in a very small number of people. That's the real issue. But I think that I would sort of make an analogous point about how do we relate to DSA. I mean, there is a low level of struggle and experience for DSA members on a lot of these questions. So, I think it's one thing to pass a resolution at the National Convention that says, here are the policies, here's the criteria, here's the orientation that you should have. The reason these things don't trickle down is not just a structural problem. It's a political problem. And it's a problem of the people who are on the ground are having very different experiences from one another. And they're not, there's very few opportunities to learn these sorts of lessons through experience. And a lot of what we say ends up just coming off as rhetoric. I mean, so it's important for us to bring these ideas, and I completely support the general spirit of what both Joe and Philip are proposing. And again, I might nitpick on details, but I agree with the general spirit of it. And I think that we absolutely have to do that. That we should do that. But it's just not enough. I think that fundamentally what's going to have to happen to convince people is to do it. And for instance, in New York, there's the operation in New York is so much more advanced than anywhere else, on basically every level of this discussion. The people who are in New York need to push those and get involved in those campaigns and push them to take more independence, and then to try to get as much experience out of them as they can, and then share those experiences with the rest of the organization nationally. There simply are not the opportunities to gain those experiences that people are getting in New York and other places, basically. Maybe Chicago is a close second. And of course, in Seattle, there's Shama Sawan. And I think there's a few places where there's a much more advanced experience with independent politics and with socialist politics than everywhere else. And so we can't expect other chapters to replicate this thing. There simply isn't the opportunity. They're not going to find any candidates that meet the criteria that you're proposing, Philip. There's no one who's going to run who fits all those criteria and is going to stick their neck out in the way that we're asking them to, because the chapter is not strong enough to support them. In New York, what do we have, 10,000 members there? The chapter is strong enough to support an independent basis. And I think that we should be trying to get those experiences. In most other places, that simply just isn't the case. So we have to be patient in that regard, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't say that we support these things. But I think the most important thing is we have to demonstrate what it looks like. And I think we should also be humble. We have very few experiences in these things. And I want to learn what you guys have to share about it. But, we have to figure out, okay, we have these general ideas that we put forward at the National DSA Convention. How complicated was it to actually enact that in Oakland, in Austin, Texas, et cetera, et cetera? How each place is going to be very challenging to bring those principles that I think we should bring and we should stick true to into reality. And part of the problem is there's a gap between what we're saying on this call and then the experiences people are having. And I think that the way that it seems like people really learn and these ideas spread is that one chapter in DSA sort of takes off with something. And then the other chapters look at that and go, I want to do that. I mean, I think the most spectacular example of this was the brake lights clinic in 2017, which I was opposed to, and I still oppose. I think it's not a good tactic, but everyone disagreed with me, and lots of people did it. And the New Orleans chapter did it, and then they wrote about it and popularized it, and people copied it because they were excited about it. I think if you want to demonstrate, if you want to convince people of what an independent political practice looks like in practice, you have to do it in your city, at the local level, and you have to push it as far as you can push it, and then show people this is what happens when we actually do what we say we're talking about. And then people will go, wow, I didn't realize you could do that. I want to try that. So I think that has to be kept in mind here.
Thanks, Jeremy. And thank you to all of our panelists for those responses. Those were really great. I would love to just sort of get to continue pulling all of this out, and I think we will. But we are going to move into our second section of this event, which is our question and answer section. So questions from the audience. We'll probably only have time for maybe 3 or 4 questions. We won't be able to get to everybody's, but you're still welcome to submit questions if you'd like to. Go ahead and submit them in the Zoom chat to submit questions here. We are going to be going through a list we'll be calling on you on the panelists this time instead of letting you choose when you go. And we'll try to keep it as short as possible so we can get as many questions in. So we'll have every panelist just get a 1-minute response, call it a Marxist lightning round. And so we'll start with the first question, and I'll read that out. This is a question that we got from Ty about Nevada. So Ty asks, what does DSA's takeover of the Nevada State Democratic Party tell us about the strategy debate within DSA? Does Nevada show the potential of the realignment strategy, or does the reaction of the corporate Democrats, the Harry Reid machine, to take the money and run, setting up a rival organization, show how coexistence of socialists with corporate Democrats within the same party is increasingly unviable? And we will start with Landry. Go ahead, Landry, and then we'll move to Joe.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I'm processing how to answer this question. So I think you laid out the takeover in Nevada. Does it push us towards realignment, or does it push us towards the incompatibility of staying within the party? Well, I think I think that it suggests, I don't think it suggests that taking over the Democratic Party is worthwhile, but I do think it maybe suggests that this is at least producing some form of struggle. So I don't want to say that, no, they shouldn't do what they were doing. I mean, they did it, and I can't stop them from doing it. And I think it is maybe going to heighten some struggle there in Nevada, because they're going to now be faced with a pretty serious set of challenges of how to build back an organization that's going to be the Democratic Party in that state is going to attempt to run through not the official party, but through parallel organization like they typically do. And I think that this kind of gets back to one of our earlier comments, which was that we should be talking about how the Democratic Party isn't just the Democratic Party. It's also the vast network of nonprofits and individuals and funding sources and that sort of thing. So I think that if we're serious about, I think it doesn't make sense to you can't take it over. You can't take over the nonprofits and those capitalist funding sources. So I don't know. Scattered thoughts. Go ahead, someone else, I guess.
That's great. Thanks, Landry. We'll do Sam next, and then Joe afterwards.
Yeah, so at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think it's really important to take an analysis into sentences like the DSA takeover of the Nevada Democratic Party, right? If you actually read any of the articles describing the situation that happened in Las Vegas, the description is always a coalition of progressive candidates backed by the local chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. And so I think the two takeaways to me, as always, are one, the strategic and sort of diffuse nature of the Democratic Party itself is a thing that I think an organized socialist movement can take advantage of and should take advantage of, as we see with argumentation around the ballot line and the sort of structural diffuseness of the Democratic Party. Good takeaway, but also important to acknowledge the difficulties of actually building tangible power within that structure in the way that takeover was organized, as I understand it. And so I think we also can't shy away from an analysis that's acknowledging that we can't just get the good people into the power and expect them to do the good thing. It's the test is going to be the ability of DSA's takeover of the Democratic Party to actually use the Democratic Party in some capacity. And if they're not set up in a mechanism to allow that, then we had a good time and we got a good news story, but we didn't actually build organizational power as a result. We maybe even won concrete positional wins and developments of bills, but ultimately, if we don't build our power, then what's the point?
Thanks, Sam. Go ahead, Joe.
Thanks. So yeah, I mean, I think that the answer is definitely the latter versus the former, in the sense that I think it does show the unviability of the Democratic Party. I'll use that example with a counterexample here in Madison to say that much of the way in which the Democratic Party functions here in our city is through the sort of informal endorsement hoarding mechanisms of the Democratic Party, such that elected officials are specifically targeting who they're going to endorse and promote and support. And they're using all of their social networks and, all of those aspects in order to basically maintain their legitimacy and their hegemony over the politics in the city. And I think that that's largely kind of what you're seeing when it comes to DSA being able to take over the formal mechanism of the Nevada chapter, while at the same time, the Democratic Party is still, easily the powerhouse in Nevada, regardless of the fact that I think they've taken over the formal mechanisms there. We see this here in Madison again with Progressive Dane is, an electoral organization here in Madison, or the Dane Party Democratic, party mechanism. They have a number of different proposals that they claim to support as organizations. And if you look at their membership, they're constantly, the elected officials are constantly voting against those exact proposals that they support and propose within their formal chapter organizations. And so there's clearly a disconnect there. Something's going on that means that those formal mechanisms aren't as important actually as you might think to believe.
Thanks, Joe. Got Jeremy, and then we'll end with Philip.
Thanks. I mean, yeah, I definitely think this is not the right path. This is not what DSA members or chapters should be focusing on. And I wish these people luck. And clearly they've got a lot of energy and talent, and they're putting it to good use. But I think that ultimately there's two problems. One is that it as people have said, they're not going to accomplish. I don't know what they think they're going to accomplish, but they're saying things in these interviews, like, for example, we're going to endorse the establishment Democrats basically no matter what, the incumbents, and we're loyal Democrats, we're team players, we support party unity, et cetera, et cetera. So, one way or another, these are not people this is not a strategy for breaking the Democratic Party. It doesn't even seem to be a strategy for ousting the corporate elements and taking over the Democratic Party. It seems to be more what is pretty common, I think, especially, outside of DSA, which is just to elect progressives, which is not bad, but we know that it's not sufficient. So I think that's that. But I also think that it's sort of a red herring in this conversation, insofar as I actually have seen hardly anyone in DSA advocate for this specific thing. I mean, if you look at the documents from CPN and SMC, from what I can tell, they also think, we shouldn't be taking over these apparatuses, and some people might be doing it, but it's not the best way for us to go forward. Even if we think we ultimately might take over the Democratic Party, this sort of thing is not. No one seems to be very interested in it.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Philip, go ahead.
I agree with what the other speakers have said. This is not the strategy I would advocate, and it's definitely part of a sort of realignment strategy. But that being said, I think also I think it's important to acknowledge this was a real victory, and I think it's impressive what they did, and it's an opportunity. But I also think the experience I would draw from what I've been able to learn from it, I think the experience actually reinforces our arguments for the importance of building an independent, democratic, member-run, working-class socialist organization, which is the essence of what, as socialists, we mean by a political party, whether it has a ballot line or not. That it's that collective organization of struggle. In that, how did Las Vegas and Nevada DSA have the power to do this, and the other progressive forces? I agree there was other progressive forces, but my impression is DSA was the core of it. Is they only had the power by building DSA over the last several years as an independent organization to have the impact they had. And second of all, I think the experience shows how empty the shell of the Democratic Party is. As people have said, they've taken this over, but what power do they have? The one thing I would say is I think they have a power of a certain platform and legitimacy. And that's where I would stress, do they use that platform? I agree completely. I don't, the idea of just being party unity and supporting establishment Democrats, I think is a big mistake. But can they use the platform and legitimacy of the positions they've won to promote independent working class struggles and building an independent democratic membership organizations like DSA? I think if they do that, they can actually help contribute towards a future workers' party. But I think there's a big danger of that pressure towards party unity of toning down their differences with the establishment.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. That was I found that very enlightening. I'm going to take another question from the audience here. This one is from Carolyn in Brotherton, which is, what should DSA candidates do once in power? Oftentimes the conversation is about the election process itself, candidate selection, platforms, actual election, etc. But a key part of this whole thing seems to me to be a dirty break from the approach to governing that's embedded within the Democratic Party. If we have independent working class party candidates, but we think they can and will govern like Democrats, we will fail. How do we incorporate developing a new approach to governing in this dirty break strategy? One that involves us, the working class, as part of the governing process versus thanks for everything and I'll see you in my next campaign. I am going to take Joe first and then Sam.
Cool. Yeah. So in my eyes, I guess, I think the most important thing is to just be a hellraiser. You know, like if you get elected as a socialist, you're probably going to be pretty lonely in whatever government you're a part of, whether it's at the local level, state level, federal, it doesn't really matter. You're very likely not going to have the ability to form any sort of serious coalition within government, but you do have the ability to use your voice out, and basically your platform to raise the stakes around social movements that are happening, whether it's locally or nationally, depending on what stage you've been elected at. And so I think the primary thing for any elected official is to use their platform to figure out how they can give voice to already existing movements and organizations, within their area, and use it to sort of be a tribune, if you will. So.
Thank you, Joe. I got Sam next.
Yeah, real quick, while I have time, I want to just go back to something that Jeremy mentioned around, like, I don't see anybody advocating for this Democratic Party policy. I think this speaks to the question that I raised around national caucuses having like a limited view on like what types of work is being done in the organization. Like, this is a thing in San Francisco where a group within the organization was pushing for an ADEMS, California Democratic Party work. And so I think it's just important to acknowledge, just because the national caucus isn't pushing a work line doesn't mean that that work line is not happening. I think that's something we need to be able to reckon with. On the question of DSA elected candidates, I think ultimately the question then becomes, how does DSA effectively wage struggle using those candidates? I think to that point, asking and expecting candidates to do XYZ without any mechanisms to establish that as the expectation and condition that expectation is not going to go anywhere. This is something we've really struggled with the Dean Preston office, where we're just balancing all of these different abstract candidate priorities and chapter work, and without a mechanism to be able to tangibly say, here are the things that DSA is prioritizing, and building the expectation that if elected, you will prioritize those things. And as long as you remain a member of DSA, work towards those specific priorities, there's not really going to be a good metric. Hell raising only gets you so far when you're evaluating a city budget that balances between police defunding and tenant relief. And so being able to actually have a mechanism to effectively manage those priorities as the organization and not as the individual candidate or elected official is the only viable path forward here.
Thank you, Sam. I've Jeremy next, and then Philip.
Thanks. I think as a group of self-declared Marxists, we come from a perspective of relative skepticism about electoral politics in general, and there are good reasons for that. However, we've all embraced it, from what I can tell. No one on this call is saying we should reject that or abstain. That doesn't mean that we then say, okay, well, the contradictions are gone. That's why we're doing it now. The contradictions are as present as they were before. We just feel more confident in being able to navigate them now. That's why we're participating in it. I think some of the things that Sam just raised are pointing to those contradictions. It's one thing to say that we fight for this radical program. It's another thing to figure out, how do you do that when you're bogged down reading 100-page reports from the city staff about potholes, and you don't have time to do that, and then they're telling you you have to vote on it, and if you don't, you're an abstentionist or a troublemaker or whatever. And I think, just to repeat something I said earlier in a different context, I think like the reason why there's so much discussion, to Carolyn's question, the reason why there's so much discussion on elections and so little discussion on governing is because we have very little experience governing, and we need to change that. But I still think the slogan that we put forward is good, which is socialist elected officials should be organizers first and legislators second. I think what Joe said is exactly right. People should be prepared to be isolated and antagonized by the establishment of both parties. That includes the city bureaucracies or the state bureaucracies who basically control what you're able to do. If sometimes we're going to be able to work with them to accomplish things. I think Shama Sawant has done a great job of demonstrating this dynamic in Seattle, that everyone hates her, it seems like, but she's been able to get a lot of things done while navigating those contradictions. I would like to learn a lot more from what they've been able to do there. The last thing I'll say is that I think the degree to which our elected officials have the confidence to fight and be isolated, but still do this organizing at the expense of making friends within the halls of power, the degree to which they're confident doing that is a reflection of the degree to how organized we are and how organized the working class is. When the working class is not able to carry out strikes and demonstrations and protests against the government, the people in government are not going to say, well, why don't I just turn to the people and they're my mandate. They're going to say, well, the city staff are the only people who have control over this, so I have to listen to them. So I think it is incumbent upon us to recognize it's not just about opportunist politicians. It's about how do we build something that they can rely on as a tool to affect the changes that they want to do.
Thank you, Jeremy. I've got Philip and then Landry.
Yeah, I think this is a great question that points to like a fundamental political challenge for the socialist movement in electoral work. Is I think we have to remember just a basic principle of socialist politics, which is that the engine of change comes from below. It comes from building mass social struggles, mass movements, collective action of working class people and the oppressed. And our vision of socialism is the self-emancipation, the self-organization of working class people. So within that context, keeping that in mind, I think participating in elections in this capitalist dominated political structure can be a useful tool as long as we keep that in mind. And if we win positions, that we don't have a strategy of trying to change things in a top-down fashion of just working through the system. But when we win elected office, there's an advantage that there's a certain credibility and legitimacy and spotlight and media attention to fully utilize that to promote and amplify and support grassroots movements. And that has to be the priority. The priority is not working within the capitalist electoral structures and political structures. The priority has to be using those positions, I think, as Joe said, as a tribune of the struggles of working class people and using that position to support and encourage struggles from below, and also the self-organization, not just struggles in a broad sense, but encouraging supporters and using every political conflict to amplify and point out and help make clear that regular people from below need to get organized, join democratic member organizations like unions and tenants organizations, but also groups like DSA, and that we have to build our power. We'll only be able to accomplish things politically if we build real power from below. I think that has to be central to any sort of dirty break and socialist strategy.
All right, thank you, Philip. And Landry to round out this question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to speak a personal opinion as opposed to anything that's reflected in my caucus. But I think, I agree that elected socialists should act as tribunes. And I think that in New York, this is a question that's very practical in New York because we've elected, a certain number of state senators and state assembly members. And I think, they can use constituent services to kind of act as sites for organization. I think that's really strong. And so I agree with all that, but I think that we also need to push ourselves to develop a socialist art of governance. And that and this is something Foucault, whether you like him or not, pointed out, right, is that Marxists have not done a great job of figuring out what do we do in office other than just obstruct. And I think that this is, there's actually openings for us to push legislation, for our elected officials to push, and so far we've just been talking about legislative office. We haven't talked about executive office. I think it's a different conversation. But in legislative office, in New York, we've had elected officials who have pushed decent legislation, a pretty big package of rent reform laws that I think was the win. And those, or other kinds of laws like around a survivor bill of rights in New York. I think our elected people can actually do some stuff in office. And I think that what this means is that we have to actually create some distance between ourselves and them. So I think they actually need to be able to play the game a little bit at this stage. I think elected socialists need to not just take for granted that they're not going to have any support in the chamber. I think that they need to have some mobility. And that means that our organization, I think, should at this stage give up some accountability and instead be pretty prepared to put pressure on them, to primary any who stop, who go really out of line. Like, elected officials need to be able to say that what they passed was really great. And we need to be able to say, yeah, it was good, but here's some of the ways that it came short. And it's not your fault. Maybe it's capitalists and other Democrats or Republicans who made it suck more, but somebody needs to say that. Yeah, okay, thank you, that's time.
Thanks all. That was great. And we are a bit over time, but we are going to have one final question. If panelists could keep it as short as possible to 1 minute, that would be great. And just for the audience, we did get 17 questions and they're still coming in. And I'm so sorry that I would love to get to all of these questions, but we're not going to keep everyone here till Saturday evening. And so we'll just do the final question and we'll find ways to continue this conversation as well. So this is a question about why not just break now? This is a question from Alan in Baltimore. And Alan says, yes, we need a mass labor party. And until we get it, we need revolutionary workers groups, no matter how small. So the question for both clean and dirty breakers is, why don't you just break already? Why do we need all this endless discussion about breaking? And why don't your caucuses launch your independent workers group / party or join an existing revolutionary workers group now? And we'll start with Sam. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've broken record again. Like, what are we breaking from? What are we breaking off? I think until we actually have the either the analysis about what we're breaking from with the Democratic Party that suggests that an immediate break is something that's even measurable and feasible, or whether we have an analysis that our organizational coherence is such that breaking off would do anything basically at all. Until we have either of those things, it's ultimately a distraction.
Thanks, Sam. Go ahead, Jeremy, and then Philip.
Well, firstly, I'd have to disagree slightly, maybe only an emphasis with what Sam said. I mean, I think that there's sometimes people really overemphasize this idea that the Democratic Party is so complicated that it's not really, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Sam, but I hear this a lot. It's not really a real party or something. It's not real, it's not a real party. Real parties are like mass parties of the European style, and Democratic Party is not a real party. So ideas like breaking from it or have to be really nuanced. I don't agree with that. It's a party. It looks like a party. It talks like a party. People think it's a party. It must be a party. I think that in the U.S. context, parties are different than other countries. But in the same way, the Bolshevik Party was a party. We all call it a party. They didn't have a ballot line. They didn't. It was illegal. They were underground. I mean, there's so many different contexts, but we know it's a party in that context. In Russia, in that time, it made sense that was a party. In our time, the Democratic Party is a party. And I think a ballot line is an essential aspect to what a party has to be. So I think it is important that we formally break and form a new party. But to the question that was asked by the audience member, I think that I think that everyone on this call all the panelists seem to agree that we have to be involved in Democratic Party elections, Democratic Party primaries. I think the Bernie campaign proved the value of doing that, but the Bernie campaign did not eliminate the contradictions of doing it, as I said before. So. But I don't think we can avoid those. Politics is going to be very hard for the socialists for the time being because of that. But I think there's no way we could simply entirely and immediately abandon participating in Democratic Party primaries, for example, in a lot of places, because that would basically ice us out from being able to talk to a lot of people at this point.
Thanks, Jeremy. Go ahead, Philip.
I mean, I fully agree with the spirit of the question of we want to move as quickly as possible towards an independent workers' party that's viable and that can have an impact. And I think I agree with what other people have said, that we have to take into account, though, the real situation. So I'll go back to the Bernie Sanders campaign that was mentioned. I think that took the form, and I think that expresses the low level of class consciousness and the weakness of independent left forces. Unfortunately, at this stage, that sort of desire for a anti-corporate, anti-establishment expression took the form of a candidate running the Democratic Party primaries. And the challenge for those of us who support independent working class politics is, how do we relate to that? I think that campaign provided an opening to build support for socialist and class struggle and independent working class politics. But to do that, you had to be part of it and really engage in it and help build it. And through that, you could actually be more effective in spreading support for independent working class politics. So I think we have to take into account the actual real terrain that we're operating on to have the most effective tactics to build support for independent class struggle policies.
Thanks, Philip. Landry, go ahead.
Yeah, looking at this question, it seems to suggest, why don't you just start an electoral vehicle with its own ballot line, etc. Well, I think that my view, and I think other panelists agree, is that, like Jeremy said, a party can be many things. And I think what's most desirable for me about an organization that functions like a party is its ability to bring together different fronts of struggle, act as that class struggle headquarters. And I agree that we should build that now. And I think DSA does a little bit of this and could do more. And I think we can develop DSA more in this direction. As for the question of why doesn't that vehicle then go call itself, contest office on its own line or call itself electoral party, I guess maybe I used to think that a few years ago. I guess I've just been won over to the idea that right now, contesting Democratic Party primaries can actually create a pretty high level of struggle. I think Bernie's campaign did it. I think in New York, we've done it. Jabari Brisport in New York ran a few years ago. Thank you, Jordan. I'll be quick this time. Jabari, a few years ago, ran for city council, got 30% of the vote on the Green Party line with 9,000 votes. That's pretty good. But then a few years later, he ran on the Democratic line in the primary for state Senate and got 56% of the vote, got like 30,000 votes. I think he was able to create struggle. The establishment hated him, tried to wreck him really hard. So I think it creates struggle.
Thanks, Landry. And Joe will take us home for this section.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think when it comes to, why don't we just break already? I think the main thing is that we should be in agreement, and I think we mostly are within this call, but broader within DSA as an organization, about the ideological need to have like a consistent message about the need to break and the need for independent politics. I think one of the things we've been lacking in the way that the dirty break has been put forward over the years has been a consistency in messaging around the need to build independence. And that, one kind of example of that, I think, is the Bernie campaign, in that, we both want to show that we support Bernie Sanders as a democratic socialist, but sometimes that's meant putting on the back burner the idea of actually putting forth the idea that Bernie is committed as ever to supporting and reforming the Democratic Party, and that's something that we all disagree with as a strategy. So that I think, when it comes to breaking, ideologically being committed to that and putting that forward as important is really kind of one place that we can start. And then, for a number of reasons that people already laid out, we do have to work within the mechanisms we have today. So sometimes that does mean using democratic ballot lines. And I think, other people already spoke to that, so I won't.
Thanks, Joe. And thank you all of our panelists and audience questions. And I hope that we'll have a chance to continue talking all these things through. So our last section, we'll just move on, will be our closing statements. We'll give each panelist an opportunity to talk for 3 minutes, wrapping up any of these threads that have come up. If there are questions that sort of left unanswered, or anything that you still want to respond to, or anything you just want to leave our audience with today as well. So we'll start with Sam. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, thank you all so much for, especially to Reform and Revolution for hosting, and for all the panelists for speaking. I thought this was a really useful discussion, a lot of really important things to consider. From Red Star's perspective and my own, I think the biggest thing that I can say for anybody on this call who's a member of DSA and trying to figure out what we can do to move towards class independence and revolutionary politics, which I think are things we're roughly aligned that we want to be building to. I think the biggest thing that I can say is just acknowledging even the structural strangeness of a panel like this. Like I said earlier, the concrete analysis of what DSA is and how it operates, I think needs to acknowledge that the formation of caucuses developing a line on DSA's work is one particular aspect of DSA's composition and not the entirety of it. And so I think, to me, the biggest thing that I can say is, figuring out ways that we can avoid, arguing about the shadows on the wall, and really focusing on like, what is DSA's actual composition? How is it formed? What are the contradictions within it? What are the reasons those contradictions have formed? And what do we actually need to do to build the type of organization that we want? I think we've had a lot of really good discussion about what that organization will look like and the approach that we want to take to build it. So then the question to me becomes, okay, what are the practical next steps? And I think really that starts with acknowledging the DSA as it's structured right now, as it's operating, looking at opportunities to, as Jeremy called out, I think really diplomatically and productively about like the mechanism for developing local struggles as a laboratory for figuring out what forms and functions are going to be useful, I think is a really great way to think about it. And acknowledging that the work of actually building to the types of nationally coordinated and revolutionary organizations that we want to build is a long process, but one that can't simply start from an idea in our heads about our organization that we want to have tomorrow, but the real process of understanding the contradictions and structures within our organization and the people that are helping power them, and making sure that they're all working in the right ways to advance the type of struggle that we want to advance.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Jeremy, go ahead.
Actually, sorry. I'm also going to send an invite to Red Start, which is our weekly education program. We've really enjoyed having folks from around DSA and outside of DSA. We think it's just a productive, pretty low lift little intervention that we found really useful. And so we'd love to see you there, bit.ly/redstartreg.
Awesome. Yeah, and panelists, please feel free to plug everything that you want to plug in the chat. I think that's really good. Jeremy, go ahead.
Thanks, everybody. And yes, thanks to the organizers. I really appreciate the opportunity. I think it's a good idea to organize this. And there's another panel tomorrow that's organized by Tempest, so I might be able to attend to that as well. I mean, I'll observe. I wasn't invited to speak. So a couple of things in my closing remarks. One is a follow-up to the question about the clean break that the last question was about. I think that on the one hand, there's a consensus that we can't just form a new party now in general, and that we are going to have to run as Democrats sometimes. But we shouldn't close the door on all independent activities. As people have laid out, most local elections are nonpartisan in many places. In California, every election is nonpartisan, except for the president. California is by far the biggest state in the country. It has a larger population than Spain. So in a state this large, to have that many elections be nonpartisan, there's tons of opportunities to run without identifying as a Democrat. There's sort of some invisible barrier to doing so. People are afraid to. Maybe it's because they'll be unviable, but the ballot line question is irrelevant. There is no such thing as a ballot line in California, except for the presidential primaries. So you're not structurally excluded from the process by running not as a Democrat, whereas you would be, for example, for New York State Senate elections, as Landry was laying out. But I do actually want to sort of push back slightly against what Landry was saying. I think that the lessons that you drew from the Jabari experience, I don't think those experiences necessarily lead to those conclusions. In 2016, he ran and lost as an independent, and now he won as a Democrat. But many other things changed in between as well. I mean, New York City DSA is 100 times stronger, more coherent, and more powerful than it was before. AOC happened, which completely changed the character of DSA's profile. The second Bernie campaign happened. A lot of things have changed since then. I don't think it is necessarily, we can assume that because he lost as an independent in the past, people like Jabari would always lose in the future. And I think that would be the wrong lesson to draw, and that would actually discourage independent activity that is worth trying. I think that the important thing about the primary system and the ballot line question, again, irrelevant in California because they don't exist here, but in New York they do, is not just we have to associate ourselves with this shitty party because otherwise no one take us seriously. It's that the primaries are easy to win. You only need 5,000 to 15,000 votes to win one of those primaries, whereas you need 100,000 to win in the general election. So if you run in March or June or whenever the primary is, you need a tiny number of votes, and New York City DSA is huge. You get 500 New York City DSA canvassers, you can win an election that only needs 5,000 to 15,000 votes. You might not be able to easily win one on the basis of sort of shoe leather organizing alone when you need 100,000 votes, but we should try it. You know, I don't think, as far as I can tell, New York City DSA hasn't won a general election, and that would require us to run against the Democrats as an independent. How much beneficial would it be in a context like that to have people have to choose between a Democrat and a socialist in the general election when way more people are paying attention and they're not just picking between two Democrats that seem sort of similar in the primary, and most people don't even participate in that. I think there are opportunities to do that with fusion voting. There are opportunities to do that here in California where you don't have to have a party, which actually makes it the primary strategy, which is sort of a shortcut to more easily electing people. That's not available in California. So I think we have to try to run people independently when we can, but we shouldn't shy away from the Bernie experience, which obviously showed us how much potential there is in taking the primary route within the Democratic Party when it's needed. Finally, I'll just repeat the same thing I brought up at the beginning, which is I think these tactics are very important. Building DSA is very important, but if we don't build a strong labor movement, most importantly, and if we don't build these social movements into something that can ultimately be the basis of a party, then these are basically academic discussions. And I don't think that we can truly advance without a higher degree of class struggle out there. And a lot of that is going to happen outside of DSA. A lot of that isn't going to be called socialist, but it's going to require DSA members to go into those struggles primarily as rank and file workers. And that's what we mean by the rank and file strategy. So thanks again, everyone, for inviting and talking. This is great.
Thanks, Jeremy. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start where a comment from Jeremy sort of took place earlier, which was essentially that he had said that we need to show in practice, I think, what it takes to build independent campaigns and candidacies at local levels. I think that's true. I think that's incredibly important. I think no one is coming to save us, right? No one is coming to save the working class, under capitalism. People are going to sort of do what they know and what they understand. And at this point, what most people understand is electoral politics as it exists within the two-party system. They understand how to canvass, how to phone bank, how to get involved in those kinds of ways. And if we actually want to kind of change what it means to do electoral work, it means, being willing within our local areas to put forward alternative strategies and to show people in practice what that actually looks like. Because people do learn through struggle, right? They don't learn through articles necessarily. A few might, but most don't. And we have to, I think, move towards putting forward candidates within our organizations rather than necessarily getting in on the back end and piggybacking off or endorsing candidates that have already decided to run. I think that's going to be important because that means that we can actually have more of an impact, I think, on the strategies that are utilized by those campaigns. We can maintain flexibility, but also have somewhat of a predetermined sort of disposition towards how a campaign should be run. And then lastly, I think we should be connecting those local struggles together with one another. So when a local campaign like the one in the Twin Cities for Rod Wansley takes place, we should be figuring out how to get that campaign in communication with another local campaign in Madison for city council, or another local campaign elsewhere, how to share resources with one another and actually just eliminate some of the redundancy and the need to develop all new materials for all these different things over and over again. We know that it's not going to come from the top down within DSA. Our national structure, I think, has serious limitations to it for any of those kinds of things to work. And so we're going to have to work together across chapters in order to develop those kinds of things. So with that said, I just guess I want to thank the Reform and Revolution Caucus for putting this on. I'm really excited that we were able to have this conversation, and I do think that there's a lot more agreement than maybe people would have expected prior to having this call. And because it was plugged by, I think, Jeremy earlier, I will share in the comments the Tempest event tomorrow on the party question, which is also going to be a similar topic to what we're talking about today. With different speakers, perhaps slightly different perspectives, but we should all be working together towards this common end, which is to just kind of destroy the system that we've got. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I definitely agree. Landry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I really want to thank the fellow co-panelists who I think have all been really sharp, really insightful. I've learned a lot from them. And also Reform and Revolution, thank you for making this such an easy panel to be on and making it so smooth. So thank you so much to Manya and Eve and everyone else in Reform and Revolution. A couple things. So what Jeremy was bringing up about Jabari's race, I think that's, I think Jeremy's has good points. Like I don't, So I'm not gonna say like here's why Jeremy's wrong. I guess it raises a couple questions for me. One is that implicit was in that comment was that making a voter choose between like intentionally like a green or socialist ballot line versus a Democratic ballot line is a more intentional choice than if you're in a Democratic primary choosing which Democrat. I think that I see Jeremy's point there. Like, I think there's a high threshold to being somebody who's, oh, I'm going to vote green. Like that's not my usual choice. I think it's a good point. I think it possibly underplays the level of conflict that was present and is possible in a primary. I think sometimes a primary can posit a really direct choice. And I think it, so I think we're coming more in line with each other. And I think a question I have for us to be able to talk more in the future about that is something we haven't talked a ton about, which is how this all relates to our orientation around progressives, left liberals, people who are sometimes in our electoral sphere, sometimes aren't. In New York, maybe this is the Working Families Party or various progressive nonprofits who are sometimes operating in tandem with us. Sometimes, like in city council races, we're running different candidates. I don't have an answer that I want to put forward there, but I think we should think through it. What does it mean to try to orient towards breaking off certain constituents of the Democratic Party? I don't know. And by closing, I also just want to bring up something I brought up in my opening, which is I think we should also, as we're talking about the dirty break and talking about the idea of creating a party, I think we should be really clear-eyed and answer things like, what is the party for in the end? It's not something we've actually spent a lot of time on, other than to say it has a really important role in organizing, and I think that's true. But why do we want to contest these offices? What strategy are we building a party in order to try to lodge ourselves into the state, into the battleground that is the state? Are we building a party for a different reason? I think that's an important question. I think, like I said earlier, it's also important for us to grapple with the history of socialist parties, which is, okay, once we do it, what's going to stop it from having the same setbacks and obstacles and co-optation and destruction that faced many other governing, very successful socialist and communist parties globally? And I think that the pink tide is maybe one place we can look for maybe a little bit of information there, but very much looking forward to talking more about this in the future.
Thanks, Landry. And last but not least, go ahead, Philip.
I think there's a broad agreement on the panel that we shouldn't have that there are opportunities and that there's legitimacy to the dirty break tactic of like the Bernie Sanders campaign showed, AOC, that the socialist movement can be strengthened, consciousness can be raised, socialist organizations be built out of left-wing and socialist candidates running on the Democratic ballot line. But I think from the point of view of the Marxist left in DSA, I think we need to stress, or I would definitely stress, and I would argue the Marxist left should stress more a point that came up in the discussion, that we shouldn't limit ourselves to only using the Democratic ballot line, and that there's real advantages and opportunities to run boldly as independent candidates. And there's actually a real downside of running on the Democratic ballot line. And sometimes we're forced to do that. And that's sort of, there's a necessity to, and then we have to find creative ways to maintain in that, if we're running on the Democratic ballot line, a clear socialist message, including about the class character of the Democratic Party as a big business institution, and have a drive to have a break within that terrain. But also, we should recognize even that there's downsides, that we're being associated with a political party that, yes, there's a socialist and left wing that's growing, but it's marginal. The dominant character of the Democratic Party, the dominant impression that most voters have when they look at the Democratic Party, is this big business establishment machine. And when we run with that label, we're associating with that. And we want to send in our campaigns a clear message that we're fundamentally different, that we're not like the normal politicians who represent corporate interests. We represent working class people and the oppressed, that we don't take money from them, that we're not part of that same system. We're running to build a bottom-up change rather than top-down. And the ballot label and party label, if we use that Democratic label, confuses that. So I think, and I would just highlight, I think I think other people have said this, there are real opportunities to run independently. I think it was in 2019 or 2018, I can't, there was one of the 5 or 6 DSA members elected in Chicago. I think it's Rosanna Rodriguez Sanchez was elected as an independent. The others were elected as Democrats. Was it fundamentally different political conditions, or was there a lack of political will in the other races where they decided to run as independent Democrats and she decided to run as an independent? The political system was not fundamentally different in the electoral laws in the 80s and 90s when Bernie Sanders successfully had a national impact, getting elected as an independent socialist, mayor of Vermont, and then as Congress in Vermont. In Seattle, I was very much involved in the campaign that elected Shama Sawant in 2013 with 95,000 votes. It was not just some marginal, like it was talked about in some of the primary races, you need a small number of votes. It was almost 95,000 votes in a citywide race with a very clear independent profile. It was technically a nonpartisan race, but the year earlier we ran the first campaign was for State House, which was a partisan race, and we had to sue the Secretary of State to be able to say socialist alternative on the ballot line, and we won that lawsuit. And we fought to be able to do that, and that was an incredibly important launching pad towards the success of 2013. So I think too often there's a lack of political will to find races where it's one-party races, where there's no lesser evil question, where we should boldly own that we are fundamentally different from the political system and proudly run as socialists and independents, and actually can be quite attractive given the huge alienation and mistrust and dissatisfaction working people have with the political system. So I think that's a key thing. I would hope that as a Marxist left in DSA, we can try to bring more self-confidence to DSA to do that more and try to find and search viable races to do that.
All right, thank you so much. I'll just keep this closing super short since I know we're 4 or 5 minutes over time. But thank you so much to our audience and to all of our speakers and panelists. I just want to say, I think this has been, I guess I'm biased because I helped run this discussion has been one of those things that really makes me excited to get back into the work in DSA. I think it's been meaningful to me to hear like-minded people talk about how to do Marxism in DSA and how to approach these thorny questions as we all learn, month by month and year by year from the experiences of socialists all over the country. So thank you so much. We posted the link to Reform and Revolution's website in the chat, so please do check it out to see future events like this, and also subscribe to our magazine, which is both online and in a fancy and we've been told suspiciously good looking print edition. So I'll leave it there and just thank you again to everybody who came today.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your Saturdays.